If you look up the anatomy of a prompt, you are probably going to find a lot of different lists. Some of them are going to have 3 elements, some of them are going to have 5 elements, some are going to have 10. They're all going to overlap. So this isn't a Bible for prompting. This is just one framework of many. One that I like to use because I think it's the simplest to understand in terms of crafting a good prompt. And you'll see that even within this context, it's not super arbitrary. There's going to be some overlap between these different kind of components of a prompt I'm going to go through. So the components themselves are the task, the detail of the task, the role, which for me only really applies to traditional models, but we'll get to that, tone, format, example, and context. Now, task, as you might imagine, is the most basic thing that pretty much absolutely every prompt needs, even a very simple one. Now, it is possible to write a prompt without a task. You can just prompt an LLM by saying hello or something, right? But in the task, you're generally asking it to do something. So you're asking it to do an action that contains a verb, usually. So summarize, spell, calculate, whatever. So for example, you could be asking, summarize the findings of a court case XYZ. Or you could ask something like, write a poem about bluebirds. Note that there's a verb at the start of those sentences. There's a verb and there's usually a noun, right? And 99% of prompts are going to need at least the task. Now, for very simple prompts, you might be okay with just the task, but usually just a one-line verb this noun command is going to be imprecise. So that's why we want to give a little bit more detail. Sentence one, verb the noun. Sentence two, give some additional color. So I'm going to use the same 2 examples throughout, summarizing a legal case and the poem. Here, for example, we could give the detail of, hey, we want you to list the legal statute to which this ruling applies and how they're affected. Or in the use case of the poem, we could say, hey, we want you to use metaphor extensively, likening the bird to a flower, for example. So this is just getting a little bit more precision and getting a little bit more specificity about what you want. Now, task and detail together are probably going to cover most of your basic use cases. Remember what I said about not over prompting? I think if you're trying to one-shot a prompt, you can start with just a task and a detail, and that will cover a lot of use cases. And then if that doesn't work, then you can try to get a little bit more technical with it and start using some of these other components. Now, role, which I think I already mentioned, is less important than reasoning models. This is because reasoning models are much more task-oriented. So when I say role, this is, and you might have seen this on some prompts, right? Before you have the list of actions you wanted to carry out, you write like you are an X or whatever, right? So you could say, if I was generating test data, I would say something like, you're a senior QA developer who has experience predicting edge cases and building test data for it, right? So to use the 2 examples I've used already, you could say you're an experienced constitutional lawyer with known for your rigorous attention to detail, or you're a bird watcher and a poet that loves striking imagery. Now, the bit, for example, with striking imagery, that could also have just gone into detail, right? It doesn't necessarily need to go into the role. I'm just pointing that out to show you that there's overlap between these concepts and to reiterate that this isn't a super didactic arbitrary list. But role can help. I think it can certainly help in terms of the sources that a model is drawing from to give you your answer and to predict the text that comes next. So I'm going to show you one of those 2 example prompts as we go along, just building it up. You can see I've put hash role, hash task detail. I don't actually usually put these in when I'm writing a prompt for a traditional model, but I'm putting it here just so you guys have that kind of visual feedback. And you can see I've put task and detail together because for me they're inextricably linked. Now, tone. And tone, again, is something that really synergizes with role. A lot of people, when they're first playing around with ChatGPT launch, when other models launched, they played around with tone a lot, right? You might have seen things like, I don't know, answer this like a pirate or answer this in an Australian accent or something. But aside from just being a fun thing to play around with, it can give a lot more specificity and, consistency to your result, especially if you're asking it to, for example, use a professional tone, or for the poetry example, using a kind of a livelier or lighthearted tone for a fun read. Stuff like this will get you more consistent results. Again, it is linked to role and to context that we're going to see later, but it's good to know that you can set that tone. Now, next is format, which for more technical tasks is actually probably one of the more important elements, especially if you're generating an output that's then going to be consumed by another system or doing something that's going to be read by someone. If you're generating a report or a summary, I think specifying a format is very important. Here I mentioned ensure the summary follows this report structure: abstract, key findings, list of statutes, conclusions, predictings for the impact of the ruling. Disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. I've never worked in law. This is probably not a good format for a legal report. I followed my heart. Now, to take the poetry example again, obviously, poetry is all about playing with form and format. Here I'm specifying line counts. I'm specifying that iambic pentameter can be used. Format is also super important if you're trying to generate, for example, test data, or if you're doing something that involves code. Usually this is important as well. I'll just show you the prompt again as it's being built. So you can see we have a role, you're a bird watcher and a poet. Write a poem about bluebirds, metaphor, bird as a flower. Poem should be lighthearted and fun. Wait, write no more than 10 lines, no less than 5. Okay, you can see the prompt taking shape. But yeah, so alongside format, if you have an output that needs to be really consistent, giving examples can really help. Now, again, this is a synergy between example and format, but you absolutely can get LLMs to produce output in, say, JSON or CSV format. And if I'm doing that, I like to give an example of for example, the JSON structure or the XML structure, whatever. You can specify most of these types, and it'll be fairly accurate a lot of the time. But what helps it be a lot more accurate and helps avoid hallucinations is giving a clear example of what that format should look like, what the output should look like. If you're using an LLM to write code, here I would give an example of, hey, this is the input variables that the function takes. This is what it should output. And bonus points if you give some negative examples as well. That shows the error handling, not just the happy path. I found that tends to get better results.